And welcome back to Backspace Academy. In this lecture on AWS Cognito, I'll start to talk about some of the services within Cognito, including the Cognito user pools, which enable us to be able to sign in using a username and password to our applications. We'll look at the Cognito Federated Identity Service, which allows our end users to be able to access AWS resources on our behalf, and to do that securely. We'll look at the Cognito Sync Key Store database and how that can enable us to, or enable our end users to be able to store data across multiple devices and sync that data across multiple devices as well. And we'll also have a look at some of the cutting edge stuff that's out there with AWS and how we can use that with Cognito to create some really modern serverless applications. And finally, we'll have a look at the troubleshooting that we can go through in case something goes wrong. The Cognito service, it adds user sign up, sign in and access control to our web and mobile applications. And it does that using user pools, Cognito user pools. And it also integrates with social identity OAuth providers, and that enables our end users to be able to sign in using their Facebook account or Google or Amazon. And it also integrates with enterprise identity providers via SAML 2. And it consists of 3 services, that being the user pools, which enables that sign in and sign out capability with a username and password. And it also has a federated identity pools service, which allows authenticated users to be given federated credentials to access AWS resources. And we also have the AWS Cognito Key Store, which enables us to store data across multiple devices and sync that data across multiple devices. Okay, so what do these 3 services look like? So on the left-hand side there, we've got our Cognito user pools, and they're going to hold a collection of our users and some basic attributes about those users, such as their name and their address and all this sort of thing. So we can have our users sign in to that user pool using the Cognito ID service. And then once they've signed in on that mobile or web application or whatever it is, the Cognito Federated ID service can then issue AWS STS, Security Token Service credentials, for that end user. And they will be temporary credentials. And those credentials will be based upon what you allow the Cognito Federated Identity service to do. And you do that through an IAM role. So if you have an IAM role associated with the Cognito ID service, and it says that you can access Amazon S3, then your end user will be able to access Amazon S3. By default, the IAM role that it will be associated with the Cognito ID service will only allow for interaction with or credentials for the Cognito Sync database and Cognito user pools. Now, also we can not only sign in through a user pool, through a Cognito user pool, we can also sign in using a social identity or an OAuth or OpenID service, again like Facebook or Google or Twitter or whatever. And we need just to associate, just the same as we need to associate our user pool to our federated ID service with Cognito, we need to associate that social identity service with our Cognito Federated ID service. And the same, we can also have our end users sign in with SAML. If, again, we associate that and build a trust relationship between that SAML application and Cognito ID. So there are basically 3 ways in which our end users can sign in to the Cognito ID or Federated ID service. Once we've got those credentials, we can then go in and synchronize our data with Cognito Sync. We can add records to the Cognito Sync database. We could also use it to access, or end users could use it to access an API gateway API that we have. We could also have it so that our AWS credentials, those temporary credentials, could access an RDS instance, could access DynamoDB or Amazon S3. So that's basically the way it works. Those three services interact together and they form that one Cognito offering. The Cognito user pools, they allow us to create and maintain a directory of our users, obviously by the name of it. It allows sign up and sign in capability for our applications, and those user pools, they can scale to hundreds of millions of users. So if you're going to create the next Facebook and you want to use Cognito as your sign-in for it, hey, it can handle it. Now, when that Cognito user pool is associated with a Cognito ID or federated ID pool, then that can be used to provide secure access through federated credentials to our AWS resources that have been defined in an IAM role. So the next service we've got there is the Cognito federated ID pools. So they create identities for our users, and those users could be in a Cognito user pool. They could be on Facebook, they could be on Google or SAML. And it allows us to federate users with those multiple identity providers. And then it can create temporary credentials for those federated users based upon what we define in the IAM role that is attached to that ID pool. So finally, we have the Cognito Sync Key Store database. So that's basically a little bit like a NoSQL database. It just has keys stored. So it's a key and a value that you can store there. So it might be high score or whatever for a game, but it stores simple data, and that data can be synced across multiple devices. So it has cross-device syncing of application-related user data. Now, it can also be used for synchronization across multiple devices, but also for offline storage. So with the Cognito Sync Manager JavaScript SDK, you can do that just by using Synchronize. And what it will do is it will update the local storage of that browser to coincide with what the Cognito server is saying. And it does that by looking at the sync count. So if your local browser that you're using has a lower sync count, then it's older information, so it will be updated. If it has newer information, if it has a higher sync count, then your local data on your browser will update the Cognito service. We can achieve the same thing with the AWS JavaScript SDK by just using update records and then looking at which will get us the most up-to-date records, and then you can just store that into browser local storage. So you can do it with one call with Synchronize, or you can do it with 2 calls with the JavaScript SDK. Either way works quite well and very similarly. So how do we use this stuff? Now, I deal a lot with solutions architects, and some of the stuff they come up with is not perfect. And solutions architects tend to get bogged down and think too much about using a backend. They think a lot about EC2 instances, auto scaling, and all this sort of stuff. And then when we talk about serverless, they seem to jump straight into Lambda. Now I've got an application here that has none of that. It doesn't have EC2, it doesn't have auto scaling, and it doesn't have Lambda. And the reason I don't use Lambda in here, even though I'm saying serverless, is because Lambda is supposed to be for short-lived, millisecond applications. So for example, if we had a Cognito sign-in and we could attach a trigger to that Cognito sign-in that may want to send a HTTP post to an application outside of AWS, that would be a perfect thing for Lambda to do, because Lambda can do that. It can do that in a few milliseconds. and then it shuts itself down and it goes away. But you don't use Lambda to create serverless apps. It's just not a smart thing to do, and it's a very expensive way to run applications. So what I've got here is one way that you could use it. You could actually have if you're doing a modern serverless app, then you're using React.js, which seems to be the hottest thing out there right now. You don't need to use a Node.js server to use React.js. It will run and run very well on Amazon S3. So all you need to do is run it on Amazon S3. Use your CloudFront distribution, and that CloudFront distribution will also have the JavaScript SDK. And so all of a sudden you've got something that doesn't use compute capacity. So where does this compute capacity come from? It comes from your end user. So your end user, they've got a mobile phone in their hand. It's got a quad-core processor. They've got a desktop app. Hey, it's got a pretty powerful processor in there. Why do we need to worry about compute capacity when our end user has that compute capacity? And that's what we mean by a modern design around serverless applications. It's not all about Lambda. It's about serverless, taking advantage of what you've got on that client side. And it's very important if you're building a very large scale application. You want to get as much compute capacity out of your end user as possible. You don't want to be paying for that. So once we've got our React.js application running on our client, on our user's desktop app or whatever it is, we can then use the Cognito user pool to authenticate that user. Or we could use Facebook, OpenID, or SAML to authenticate that user. Once that user is authenticated, then the Cognito federated ID service can issue federated temporary credentials to our end user. And that end user could then directly access DynamoDB if they wanted to. We don't even need Lambda there. We can send queries directly to DynamoDB without using Lambda. And also without even using API Gateway as well. And there is another new service that's out there from Amazon called AWS AppSync. Now, AWS AppSync is a GraphQL server. Now, the developers, you'll know all about GraphQL, and if you don't know all about GraphQL, go out and find out about it. Solutions architects don't normally know about this stuff, but you need to understand it because it's quite revolutionary. So no longer restricted to NoSQL databases or SQL databases or APIs, REST APIs and this sort of thing. We can define the way that we handle data with GraphQL. And GraphQL is growing rapidly, just the same as React.js is growing rapidly, and they're all supported and developed by Facebook. So they're going to be here for a long time. So what we can do is that we can run our React.js application and we can send our queries through GraphQL, which will go directly to AWS AppSync, off to DynamoDB. And we can also put in front of DynamoDB, we can put the DynamoDB Accelerator or DAX, and that is another new service for 2018, same as AWS AppSync, that caches, so it's a little bit like Elasticache for RDS. It caches our regularly used content on DynamoDB. So that is a very modern way of doing applications. So if you're a solutions architect, get your head around this stuff. Try and use your end user's compute capacity. If you're working for a large enterprise and they're going to have a few 100,000 users, that could cost you a lot of money in compute capacity, user client's compute capacity. So what happens when something goes wrong? What are the troubleshooting steps that we should take? So first off, if we're using S3 to host our website, we need to make sure that our bucket has cross-origin resource sharing set up on it. If we don't do that, Any calls to the Cognito service will be blocked for security. So make sure you've got cores set up on your bucket before you do anything. You need to make sure that the IAM role that you're associated with the Cognito Federated ID pool has an allow for that AWS service that you're trying to access. So if you find that you cannot access Amazon S3 through Cognito and with those temporary credentials, go and have a look at your IAM role and make sure there is an allow to make that happen. You also need to specifically define your authentication services that you're going to be using with your Cognito Federated ID pool. So if you're going to be using Facebook, you need to make sure that the Facebook ID and all the Apple ID and all that stuff is set up in Cognito. If you're going to be using a Cognito user pool, make sure that the user pool ID is in there and that is set up as well. The same with SAML, and you need to build that relationship between Cognito ID and your authentication service. Otherwise, Cognito ID will not do anything with that authentication service. Another big issue with Cognito that I have found is that there are a number of JavaScript SDKs out there. The code is all over the place in the developer manual, and there's a lot of breaking stuff going on. So it's always a good idea, I find, if you're using Cognito as a developer, to use the AWS JavaScript SDK. It has a lot of Cognito features in there. And if you want to go a bit further than that, you can use the Cognito JavaScript SDK. I don't use all of the other SDKs. There's a Cognito Sync SDK. There's a whole heap of others, but they have issues. And if you have a look at the AWS forums, there are a lot of outstanding issues for those other SDKs. So you can't really go wrong using the AWS JavaScript SDK. It's quite stable and doesn't have any breaking changes that are going to cause you problems later on down in the track. Okay, so that's all I need to talk about with Cognito. I hope you've learnt a lot, and if you are a developer going on to do the Certified Developer exam, I'll look forward to seeing you in a 6-part lab on that, which will be quite huge. So I'll look forward to seeing you developers in that one, and solutions architects, I'll see you for now, and I'll see you in the next lecture.